Thank you. Well, I'm excited to moderate this panel where we'll hear some empirical research, and then we'll talk about the research practitioner partnership, which I think is pretty exciting, and given the morning's conversation, it's a nice flow into this next topic. So I'm going to go through and introduce our panelists today, and I have to say I've fallen into the same pattern, so I'm going to give their pedigree and then move on. So sorry, we don't have any interesting facts, but here we go. So for the Michigan project, we have Alex Bartik, who's an assistant professor of economics at the University of Illinois and a research affiliate at the Poverty Lab at the University of Chicago. And his research focuses on the effects of policy on outcomes for middle and low income workers. Bryan Stuart, an assistant professor in the Department of Economics at George Washington University. He's an affiliate at the Institute of Labor Economics, and his research focuses on the effects of government policy on labor market outcomes. Then their policy partner, Ben Damerow, is the director of Michigan Works Southwest. He's also the chair of the Michigan Works Directors Council. And our Chicago team, Sara Heller, is an assistant professor of economics at the University of Michigan. Her research focuses on policy interventions aimed at reducing crime and improving outcomes for low-income youth. And Evelyn Diaz, who is the president of Heartland Alliance for Human Needs and Human Rights. She was the CEO of the Chicago Workforce Investment Council, associate director of the Chicago Jobs Council, and the deputy chief of staff to former Chicago Mayor Richard Daley. So today we're going to start with the Michigan team first.
All right, thank you very much. We are really excited to be here talking to you about our project where we're providing tailored information to job seekers in Southwest Michigan. So you're going to hear from me first, and then Ben, and then Alex. Now, for motivation, I want to start in Lordstown, Ohio. There's a very nice article in the Washington Post recently written by Heather Long, and you can see the headline here, from $22 an hour to $11. And basically, this article describes the arc of job loss that has been experienced by certain workers as GM has cut jobs and then eventually shut down the Lordstown plant. What's really interesting to us from this article is that you see workers experiencing very different trajectories. So the article describes Scott Metzepezo, who used to make something like $20 an hour, now makes $11 an hour. He's working part-time at a pizza restaurant. On the other hand, we have somebody like Cicero Davis, who had similar earnings before he was laid off, but now he's working full-time as a corrections officer, and actually on his days off, he uses his commercial driver's license to deliver RVs. So these are dramatically different outcomes for these workers. And one motivation for what we're thinking about is why some workers made transitions like Metzepezo and why others made transitions like Cicero Davis. So our project is not only or even exclusively about layoffs from auto plants, but we think this is really useful motivation. Now, of course, there's other motivation for this as well. Academic work, I think there's now growing evidence showing that essentially workers seem to respond perhaps slowly to disruptions in the labor market. And then that leads to lasting consequences for their labor market outcomes. So we can see this, for example, from the rise of import competition from China, or as we look at the consequences of the Great Recession. For the purposes of today and for this project, I think it's also important to note that it's really the lesser, people with lower amounts of income and lower amounts of education seem to experience particularly severe effects from these labor market disruptions. So as we think about the types of explanations for that, of course, there are several. It could be that individuals have moving costs across places, industries, or occupations. You can think of those as monetary, so it's costly to move your family across the country. Could also be psychological, that there are frictions that limit people's mobility across different parts of the labor market. Could also be that individuals, the skills that they can bring to the labor market do not align especially closely with the skills that employers are demanding. We've kind of had some discussions about that already today. Could also be that workers have overly optimistic expectations. This article actually describes Metzepezo as saying, look, I thought my job was going to come back, so I didn't really think about retraining here. There are a lot of explanations. The one that we're focusing on in this project is that workers might have imperfect information about the set of opportunities that are available to them in the labor market. Now, we heard from Jed and we know about the rise of job websites, so we should say Look, of course, there's a lot of information that's published and that's out there from both private and public sources. For our purposes, there are two, I think, really important features of that information. One, for the most part, it is not tailored. So it can be hard for individuals to know the degree to which that information applies to their individual setting. And the second thing is that there's just so much information out there that it might be potentially overwhelming. So if we tell workers that there are 450 occupations for you to search in, that's a pretty hard task for them to go after. So what we're going to do in this project is focus on answering two questions. The first kind of descriptive question we want to go after is whether job seekers have accurate perceptions about their labor market opportunities. Of course, there's a long literature in economics thinking about the existence and the presence of imperfect information. There's less empirical evidence on that, and so that's one thing that we want to go after. And the other question that we're going after is how providing tailored information to job seekers affects not only their perceptions about the labor market, but also the extent to which they search for jobs, how they search for jobs, and then ultimately their employment and their earnings. To answer these questions, we're going to pair some novel surveys with a randomized controlled trial that's being done with Ben and Michigan Works, our implementing partner. So the individuals in this randomized controlled trial will be mostly low and middle income job seekers in Southwest Michigan. Alex is going to tell you a lot about the intervention. The kind of short version of this is that we're creating a website and a smartphone app that's going to provide tailored information to individuals about the occupations that they might want to consider based on their skills and their preferences. So that's where the tailoring is going to come in. Importantly, and thanks to Indeed, we're also going to be able to show people real-time job postings as well. So instead of just saying, maybe you want to consider being a sheet metal worker, we're going to say, these are the jobs in this region that are open at the moment. We think of this project as being of broader importance in maybe two main ways. First of all, we're just interested in whether imperfect information limits the economic opportunities of workers, and particularly of low-income workers. We know that there are a lot of potential barriers. Going after information can be particularly attractive from a policy standpoint. And the other broad question here is whether we can increase the effectiveness of federal employment services. So about 10 million individuals a year receive federal, state-funded employment services. But the funding, as Ben will, I think, describe, the level of funding for those services is oftentimes quite low. And so we're also interested in the potential broader impact of that here. Okay, so what are we going to talk about over the next 25 minutes or so? Ben's going to describe what Michigan Works Southwest does. Alex is then going to walk you through kind of the origins of the project and the design of our randomized controlled trial. I should say at the outset, this is a pilot project. So we are actively, and I do mean actively, designing and implementing this as well. So we expect to roll this out over the course of the summer. So I think unlike Sara and Evelyn, we won't have results to share, but we'll give you kind of a peek into what it's like during the implementation phase.
Good afternoon, I'm Ben Damerow, and I'm going to give a brief overview on Michigan Works Southwest. So we operate a four-county workforce development board in Southwest Michigan. We have 4 service centers. The counties, 2 are rural, 2 are urban. We have just over 500,000 individuals in the 4 counties. The labor market outcomes and education are similar to Michigan. And as you'll see later in our slides, we do have a higher share of jobs in manufacturing than the rest of the U.S. We provide a variety of services to both job seekers and employers, and we have about 150,000 visits per year at our 4 service centers. So the services that we provide, our overall goal is to connect job seekers, employers, training providers, and educators. All unemployment individuals must visit a one-stop service center as part of their work test, but it's also, our services are available to the general public as well. So we do have funding for a variety of different programs. We have about 40 different fund sources and programs, but it's very limited in terms of the number of individuals that we can provide one-on-one services to. So earlier, the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program was mentioned. We call that the Cadillac of employment and training programs. There's just a variety of different supportive services and training that can be provided through that program. We also operate the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, and then also the Cash Assistance Program through the TANF. Staff conduct in-depth assessments and provide personal advice to individuals and refer them to training through outside training providers and community colleges. And then in our employment services in Wagner-Pizer, this is what Bryan had mentioned, this level of funding does not exist for us to provide that one-on-one assistance to everyone who walks through our doors. So just about 95% of the individuals that come through the one-stop service center, they do not receive that intensive one-on-one support. So for them, we offer job fairs, employer of the day events, workshops. So we're reviewing their resumes, giving them assistance on interviewing, and then we have a computer bank to help with their job search. So one of the questions or one of the issues that we're continuously dealing with is how do we better serve these individuals? So just in the initial discussions with Alex and Bryan and what they were proposing, we were really excited about the potential impact that this could have not only on our 4 counties, but in the state of Michigan and nationally as well. So Alex is going to talk about the project origins and how this all came together.
So first off, I want to thank Bryan and Ben for being nice to me. It's always dangerous being the third person talking in a limited time frame, because sometimes you end up with not quite as much time as you'd hope, but they've been friendly today. So before we get into actually the details of this project that we're planning on doing, I thought just to kind of contribute to kind of this panel, I'm thinking about how researcher practitioner partnerships can be set up. I'm going to kind of talk you through the history of this project. And luckily, it actually involves a bunch of other people who are in this room. So Bryan and I, based on some research that we both had done before and collaborated on, we're really interested in trying to quantify better kind of the extent and effects of imperfect information in the labor market. So we've been brainstorming about this for a while and started reaching out basically to different practitioners to see if we could get their insights and kind of work with them to kind of learn more. And actually through my dissertation advisor, David Otter, who's here, I knew about his work with Sue Hausman on temporary jobs in Michigan. I know that they had collaborated with one-stop job centers in Michigan. And so we reached out to Sue Hausman to talk to her about her work and if she had any ideas. And she put us in touch with Ben. And then we had a really exciting first phone call with Ben. I think he was driving from Lansing to Kalamazoo. He's a very busy guy. And we started kind of outlining what we were thinking about, but then got his thoughts on what he thought was important as well. And so we had some ideas from the initial conversation, but Ben's really big emphasis was you have to come visit the offices and not just talk to me, but also talk to the managers, the counselors, and clients themselves. And so we did an extensive, and actually now we've done, I think, 3 visits of kind of 2 to 3 days each, where we kind of spend the whole day just talking to clients, talking to job counselors, and really getting a sense for kind of their views as to the constraints and what would be useful to kind of help improve the transitions of some of these workers. And then after this kind of series of conversations, then we started to kind of design the study based on this mixture of both ideas from the Michigan Works staff and the Michigan Works clients, and some ideas that Bryan and I brought to the table too. So it really kind of was like a joint collaboration in building the ideas that led to the study. And it was also, partially in part thanks to funding from JPOD North America's Work of the Future initiative. So kind of during these brainstorming sessions, kind of Bryan and I came out with a bunch of ideas and things we were generally interested in. But Michigan Works leadership and staff highlighted a few elements that we weren't thinking about as much. The first is Michigan Works, as Ben mentioned, was very focused on these clients that they're not able to provide these one-on-one intensive services to. And so that we kind of immediately turned our focus to that group because that's the group that he felt there would be the most value added from these types of services. Second, and this was a thing that came up again and again, is that they want to kind of better quantify right now their client flow, needs, and service usage. And the Michigan Works staff had a bunch of thoughts as well. I mean, the big one that made this study seem like it would be worthwhile is they emphasized that they felt that job seekers that were coming in to talk to them didn't have nearly enough information about the types of jobs that they might be qualified for and that might be good fits for them. In particular, they actually emphasized that basically there's 2 work groups, long tenured workers who haven't been on the market for a long time, and then kind of workers who didn't have much of a work history, who particularly didn't seem to have a ton of information. And the second is they also wanted kind of more real-time quantitative information on the job seekers that were coming in so they could help kind of prepare services and work to make the service centers work better. And so kind of based on these conversations over several visits, we kind of developed, 3 big goals for our project. The first is, this is going to be important both for the experiment and also making it as useful to Michigan Works as possible. We're going to build a new client intake system where instead of clients coming in and filling out a paper form, we're going to build a new tablet system where everybody who is going to come in is going to get entered into a database, which is both going to allow them to be kind of more seamlessly matched to the different programs that Michigan Works provides, but is also going to provide a way to kind of collect data on who's coming in, and third, to kind of intake people into our experiment. Second, as Bryan mentioned, we're going to conduct a set of really detailed surveys about what clients know about the labor market. And that's both going to be focused on kind of the more traditional quantitative metrics about what they might make if they worked in different jobs, but also some of the different measures of the trickier to measure features about what it's like to actually work at a job. What are the amenities like? How are you really treated at that job? And so we're going to kind of measure what clients know about these features. And third, we're working on building a website and smartphone app that people can use both at the Michigan Works centers, and it'll kind of be promoted there, but also at home that'll provide kind of, as Bryan said, individualized job search assistance that's focused on kind of, what would be the best options for a person with certain characteristics and background and preferences to these clients that Ben highlighted don't qualify for one-on-one counselors. So that was kind of like the ideas that came, after having these kind of extensive conversations with Michigan Works. And then after kind of getting those thoughts together and kind of really building that plan, then Bryan and I started designing the RCT that we're going to run, that we are going to begin the preliminary parts of launching May 20th. So there's nothing like a commitment device, like saying something in front of like 75 people. Okay, so this is basically what the experiment's going to look like. So as I mentioned, we're going to start that everybody who comes into a Michigan Works office is going to fill out an intake form. And that's the part that we've redone that's going to totally kind of redo how people come in and start to access services at the one-stop job centers. That intake survey will have kind of detailed questions about their background and their experiences, which helps Ben identify which programs that they qualify for, but it's also going to help us tailor the recommendations that we give to their background and experiences. Second, we're going to have questions about their preferences, about what kind of jobs that they would like to have on a variety of dimensions, both wage and non-wage. And that's going to help us really focus on the jobs that, given what they say they care about, are actually going to provide high value to them. Then people who fill out that intake form are going to be invited to our website, which is kind of really the actions happening in the study. And they'll be able to access both in the Michigan Works computer labs and also on their own phone or computer if they have access to that. And on that baseline survey, we're going to ask some basic questions. On the website, they'll fill out a baseline survey. Well, they'll answer some basic questions about what they perceive to be the different labor market opportunities in different occupations within their area. So, what do I think I would make if I, move to occupation X, or what do I think the hour stability is like in a given occupation, to get a sense for kind of, how high quality is people's information about the labor market. And then once they fill out that baseline survey, they're going to be randomized into a treatment and a control group. The control group will still get access to the website, and it'll be kind of a version of a lot of the general flyers that Michigan Works provides right now about kind of general advice on searching for a job. It's kind of more not tailored to your particular circumstances, but just general advice. And then the treatment group will actually receive this tailored information product where, based on the characteristics and your preferences, there'll be kind of detailed information about jobs that we think are particularly good fits to you. And I'll talk about what's exactly going to be in that information in a little bit. And finally, we're going to measure outcomes using both, I think, some interesting follow-up surveys that we're going to do via text message on a pretty high-frequency basis. We're hopefully going to get at least fairly high response rates, kind of, thanks to the JPAL funding that's going to allow us to provide survey incentives. But also we'll be able to measure a bunch of outcomes by linking to the state of Michigan UI data, which will kind of let us both kind of measure some of those earnings outcomes we care about a lot, but also follow people over a longer time period. So I think it's easiest to think about the intervention if you look at a picture, and I'll go to that in 1 second. So basically, like, the treatment group's going to get information on 40 occupations. It's going to have information on, general information, kind of individualized information, and job postings. And the control group's just going to get this general information. I think it's easiest to see this based on an example. So let's think about what a newly unemployed 39-year-old with a high school education will see. Let's say they were previously employed as a material mover, earning a little bit less than $12 per hour, and that they say they care equally about wages and amenities like having stable hours. What will they be recommended? So the first thing that they will see when they go to the website is they'll see a series of screens like this that show occupations ordered by what we think the best options for them, given what they said might be. And depending on if you're on your phone or a computer, it might show 2 or 4, but there'll be up to 40 that you can kind of scroll through. And on this kind of screen with these kind of icons, you'll be able to see kind of general information on the job and what you have to do, and then kind of our kind of individualized using machine learning prediction for what we think they would actually earn in that job, kind of given their characteristics. So then let's say that you're this job seeker who's looking, and you think this heavy and tractor-trailer truck driver's option looks good. I can click on that. What will I see? Well, then what I'll see is I'll see a 2-panel screen, which on the left-hand side is going to have more detailed information about that job, including like the task that it uses and the type of skills that it requires, our prediction for how much money they could earn in that job, and then a bunch of information about other characteristics of that job. We've included it all here, but it'll include stuff like how regular are the hours. We'll include flags for if we think you might need to get additional training for this job, and other information that might be relevant during people's job search. And then if people read that information and they like it, to the right, thanks to the a generous collaboration that we have with Indeed, thanks to Jed and Tara Sinclair, we're going to be able to pull in Indeed job postings on jobs that are available within the commuting radius that this person has specified. So this shows some listings for different kind of truck driver jobs that are in this area. So you can go from getting this general information about different types of jobs you might consider to getting some detailed information on that job features and what your life might be like if you have that job, to directly kind of clicking through and getting straight to the Indeed website and maybe applying to one of those jobs or seeing the more extensive Indeed listings. And so that's kind of like the basics of the overall treatment and the overall experiment. And then I talked about a little bit before, but kind of to detail the data that we're going to have. From the intake survey, we'll get kind of some of that really rich demographic, work experience, and preferences information that's really going to inform our model for helping make recommendations. Then the baseline survey, which I think we think is really important, is to get a sense of like what is people's baseline information, which I think is something that we don't always have great evidence on right now. And then we'll have kind of these 2 sets of information, these follow-up surveys, where we're going to get kind of a detailed look at how people's job search is progressing throughout their unemployment spell or their job search while they're on the job. So we'll see like the number of types of applications that they have and details on their employment situation. And this will be done through a mixture of text message surveys and website surveys. And then at the end line, we'll do a more extensive survey where we kind of talk about their overall perceptions on the job search 12 weeks after they finish the job search, as well as how their information and beliefs about opportunities in different occupations has changed. And so the hope is we'll be able to see what their information is at baseline and how that information changes as a result of our treatment, before finally turning to the UI data and some other sources, which allow us to see, has this change in information actually led to changes in actual labor market outcomes, both in terms of whether they're employed and how much they're earning, but also if jobs seem to be a better match with what they said they wanted beforehand in their stated preferences. So I think this is really an example that speaks to some of the conversations we had today, like, both actually like doing the study, but also really getting the ideas that led us to fully develop the different features of this study wouldn't have been possible without the way that we are really closely working with Michigan Works. So for example, Michigan Works really highlighted a couple of key pieces that they felt their clients had very strong preferences over. They were a big part of what we're incorporating in the app. So for example, something that Michigan Works kind of counselors really mentioned is that there are often certain specific sets of occupations or industries that people have worked in before that they have very strong preferences to not work in again. A lot of people are like, I've worked in food prep before, I would do anything rather than do that again. And so we're kind of incorporating that kind of preference into the tailoring is something that we're definitely doing. A second thing that they brought up is that like they kind of partition their workers into kind of two types, one of whom was really kind of, set on getting a really high wage job, and the other who just wanted a job fast. And that's also a dimension where you might want to provide pretty different recommendations. And so I think, this is an example where it's not just they were doing the study, but they really kind of helped design it with us. And kind of, related to some of the kind of topics that have been discussed today, we're focused on kind of one dimension of information right now, but I think long term, we'd like to, as we could continue this collaboration, help try to understand other dimensions of worker transitions. And one thing that we're particularly interested in thinking about that's been highlighted some today is the way in which information can help people make better training transitions. So we're going to kind of provide a little bit of information about that in our experiment, but I think long run, you could have a much more detailed intervention to focus on kind of tailored training information that I think could also contribute to our understanding of how to help workers make better transitions. So I think that's kind of like the broad overview for our experiment and how it was set up. And we're kind of looking forward to learning from Evelyn and Sara, and then also all your questions and stuff. So thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody. I am Sara Heller. I'm an academic, but today I'm really here as a storyteller. So I am not going to give you an academic presentation. I'm going to tell you the story of our joint partnership, where it came from, how we set it up, a little bit about what we found and what happened next. And then I'm going to turn it over to Evelyn to tell you all of the smart stuff for the day about sort of all of the lessons that we've learned about how these kinds of partnerships worked. So let me take you back to Chicago 2012, which is when this project started. When 479 people were murdered in the city of Chicago. So that is a tragically large number. For a little bit of context, to be fair, Chicago is also a very large city. So if you look at rates, that's actually only the 31st highest homicide rate in the country, but it's nonetheless a problem that demands action. And so 2012 was also towards the beginning of the last mayoral administration. And so the city was sort of coming in, and the new administration was coming in and thinking about their funding allocation. And in particular, Evelyn was the new commissioner of the Department of Family and Support Services, who was looking at her $36 million annual budget for after-school programs and youth employment programs, which included this umbrella term called One Summer Chicago, which is a whole bunch of different programs that provide 24,000 summer jobs to youth between 16 and 24 years old. And she looked at this funding and she said, okay, is this money actually improving education, reducing violence, changing long-term employment outcomes? And there's reasons to think that summer jobs programs might do those things, right? So they provide income, they provide information on returns to schooling, connections to employer networks, they might actually teach skills or develop self-efficacy, and there's a sort of basic incapacitation effect. If kids are working over the summer, they can't at the same time be getting into trouble. But when you really start to think about the theory, it's not entirely clear-cut. Crime mostly happens nights and weekends, jobs mostly happen during the day, so incapacitation itself might be poorly targeted. Kids might use their new income to buy things like alcohol and drugs, which could actually increase crime. So the answer isn't clear. And so that brought us to our partnership, which is, I think, not a rare occurrence that practitioners have this set of questions, right? We have a social problem, how do we solve it? Does this program work? Does this program work better than something else? And who responds most to our program? So these are pretty common questions that policymakers have, which led us to our partnership process about the summer jobs program. So we started by sort of deciding to take the whole One Summer Chicago umbrella and peel a little tiny piece of it off to actually evaluate, to experiment with and try to answer the questions that we had. So we started with a bunch of meetings on program design. And fortunately for me, I was a graduate student in Chicago at this time, so I had infinite time for meetings. Which actually I think turned out to be pretty important, because I think for partnerships like this, being in the room really does matter. And so we started talking about program design, and I shared sort of what my read of the research literature was on what we knew didn't work and what we thought might work, and sort of built that into some of the design elements. We started to tease out our research questions. And so this was a sort of back and forth between me suggesting questions that I thought would be scientifically interesting, the programs team suggesting questions that they thought were sort of logistically important about implementation, and us sort of figuring out what are the possible questions we could answer here, and what are the implications of those questions for how we actually design the study. And so I wrote a couple series of memos saying, here's how we could set up the study, and if we do this, this is the set of questions we're going to be able to answer. Or we could do this completely different thing, which is then going to let us answer this different set of questions. And so I sort of laid all of that out, and then I did something that does not come very naturally to researchers, nor to me as a person, which is I ceded control. And I said, here's the memo, here are the things we could do, this is your program, you guys decide. And so they sort of looked at that and they said, this is the thing I'm excited about, and I said, great, let's do it. Let's actually make this study happen. So then we started working on the logistics. Well, we knew we wanted this to be a program that would help reduce violence, which means we have to find where the kids are who are actually at risk of violence. How are we going to do that? We did a lot of talking. We decided to sort of recruit through high schools that are in disadvantaged neighborhoods, which was kind of a risk because not everyone goes to their neighborhood school, and we weren't sure sort of who was going to be there, but we had to take some educated guesses. And we implemented our study. And so we ended up with this experimental program called One Summer Chicago Plus, to actually test whether this particular summer job program can reduce violence. So let me tell you quickly about what the program ended up looking like. It was run by Chicago's DFSS and a network of nonprofit partners. At the time, it was 8 weeks for the summer program, all government and nonprofit minimum wage jobs, 5 hours a day, 5 days a week in this first study year. Everyone got an adult job mentor. So this is an adult who was paid at a ratio of about 10 youth to 1 adult, whose job it was to help the kids with their barriers to employment. So whether that was actually getting the identification and paperwork you needed or navigating conflicts with supervisors, the adult was there to help make sure the kids succeeded. Sort of a package of other things, a little bit of a job readiness training, a meal a day, bus passes when kids needed it. And for half the youth, they spent a little bit less time working and some time engaging in a cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT-based curriculum at the same wage. So the stuff I'm going to show you today is going to mash both of those treatment arms together and just show you sort of something about the program versus everything else, though I'm happy to tell you more about the rest of it if you're interested. So we set up the study as a randomized control trial because we knew that we were not going to have enough money to fund a slot for every kid who might be eligible, who might be able to benefit. And in fact, as I remember, basically the day before the lottery, we were still trying to figure out how much funding there were and how many program slots there were going to be. And I would say, more, we need more power. And she would say, I'm trying. So what we ended up with is a little over 1,600 applicants for about 700 program slots. And then we were going to track these youth in administrative data. So this was my entire third year of graduate school, is navigating all of these data sharing agreements to be able to track them in administrative data. And you can see one of the first things we learned here, if you can sort of see this. So this is a map of Chicago. Darker red is higher violence areas, and each green dot is an applicant. So one of the things we learned is that targeting through schools in this way actually did get to the kids who were living in the highest violence community areas in Chicago. So that was something we weren't sure about before. So I'm going to do this a little bit chronologically. So we did this. We implemented this study in the summer of 2012. And now we're into the winter of 2012, 2013. And we had just gotten our first pull of data. So we had about 3 months of follow-up data. And there were these tiny little hints of violence reduction. So certainly nothing that we would call scientifically valid, nothing was statistically significant. And yet, the city had budget deadlines to decide what it was they were going to do in the summer of 2013. I know this will come as a shock to this audience. It turns out academic timelines, not always exactly the same as policymaking timelines. And so I sort of brought in, I said, look, this is what the data we have show. I put a lot of caveats on it. I said this is not statistically significant. We're really not sure about it, but there's this point estimate that looks like maybe violence could be going down. Don't quote me on that. And so Evelyn said, okay, if there's even a little bit of a chance that this program is actually reducing violence, I want to target the people who are at the highest risk of violence. Let's get the more disconnected youth. Let's focus just on boys because they're disproportionately involved in violence. And I said, great. I have to tell you, I don't think the program is going to work for this population because we have all of this sort of other older job training literature that suggests that that sort of disconnected population doesn't necessarily respond, but it's an empirical question. So let's find out, right? Let's ask the research question, for whom does this program work best? And we made a couple small tweaks to the program as we went along as well. So now 2013 is being implemented. We get our longer term follow-up data from the first study. And this is what we find, is that in fact, that initial drop in violence did pan out. And we saw about a 42% decline in violent crime arrests in the first year after random assignment. So that's a huge decline, right? Everyone is very excited about this drop in violence. I am also excited about it because as sort of hinted at before, sometimes academics get excited about publications. We also published this in Science, which was very exciting for me. And it turns out that we were not the only people excited about this. The results also made national news. So as a sort of counterpoint to Abby's, I think, right point about how the news can sometimes turn us against each other and sort of say everything we know is wrong, this is a situation where we sort of had this new finding, it got some attention, and the result of that was that it was easier for the city to raise money, right? So this sort of made news and philanthropists paid attention. And they said, now we have some evidence about what actually works to reduce violence. Let's give some money. So what happened next? We got sort of all of this attention from other researchers, from other cities, and the increased funding allowed for a program expansion. And so the commissioner decided we're gonna sort of take the summer of 14 off because now we have more program slots. We need to actually scale up responsibly. We need to not just sort of throw this at everything we have. We're gonna work out some of our implementation details with this new money and then come back in 2015 and ask some follow-up questions. So we set up the 2015 study, because we're sort of continuing this partnership, to ask the question about how much the adult mentor mattered, right? So the city said, look, this adult mentor piece is an expensive part of the program. Is it really necessary to have these program effects? And anecdotally, all the people on the ground in Chicago said yes, but we also had this evidence from New York where they don't have a separate adult mentor, and that's also reducing violence, in fact, so much that it seems to be decreasing mortality there. And so we set up the study to sort of test this question. And then tragedy struck. Evelyn left her job. That part of the story has a happy ending, as you'll hear at the end of her talk, but at the moment, it had real consequences for sort of what we were doing. So one of the things that happened is that in the transition, there was not as much senior supervision of what was happening on the ground in the program as we might have liked there to be. So we had these sort of two treatment arms that were trying to separate mentorship and no mentorship. At the end of the day, it's not exactly clear how different the services that those two groups got. Another thing that happened is that for the first time in this series of studies, I ceded control even further and I let go of my own control over the treatment and control lists. So in the past, this was always mine. I handed the treatment list over myself. Everything was nice and clean and orderly, just like I like it. Here they had sort of set up this new online system. They wanted the treatment needs to show up in the online system, and so I passed that off to somebody else. And despite months and months of planning about exactly how this would work, and the control list would be on a wait list that would be held out elsewhere, what actually happened is that the control list was just accessible to the providers. So they could just click through all the way through the treatment list and then all the way through the wait list. Devastating. So we caught it in time to potentially salvage it. So we're still sort of trying to figure out what we can learn from this study here. But I think part of what that demonstrates is the importance of having a partner who actually is sort of supervising really closely what's happening on the ground level. All is not lost. We're still sort of working on learning more about this. And so we're doing some non-experimental comparisons now from 2016, where we have data across a whole bunch of different Chicago programs. So not just One Summer Chicago Plus, but also a bunch of other types of summer programs in Chicago to try to answer the question, does it matter what kids actually do over the summer, or does it just have to be something? So let me close the loop now on sort of what we learned from the first set of studies, since these are all still ongoing. So I told you when we sort of expanded the population for the 2013 study to a more disconnected population, that I didn't think that the program was going to work for them. I was totally wrong. So that's the first set of results that you've already seen. This is the second one, where we basically replicated a very similar set of results. These kids are committing a lot more crime because they were recruited partly out of the criminal justice system. But we still see this 33% decline in violent crime arrests in the year after random assignment, right? So this sort of replicating with a new population. And so let me wrap up by just sort of saying what other substantive lessons that we have learned from this sort of set of projects. So one is that summer jobs programs don't really seem to be improving college and career readiness, which you hear the sort of people who implement these programs say a lot is one of the things that they think the program does. So we don't see any changes in any education outcomes, nor do we see changes in employment outcomes, at least in the sort of short to medium term. What we do see is this violence decline, even among these more disconnected youth. So these programs might not be doing quite what we thought they were going to, but they do something very socially important. That said, we're using some new machine learning techniques to identify treatment heterogeneity, and we find a group whose employment does improve. So we find a subgroup of the sample whose employment within sort of a 2 to 3 year span goes up by 15 percentage points. It's like 36% relative to their baseline mean. That group is younger and more attached to school. So it's not these sort of out of school, out of work youth who most youth employment programs are targeting, right? They're the kids who are sort of doing a little bit better in school, still attached to school. Now they're not doing great. They still have pretty low employment rates at baseline. But this also potentially is a lesson that we should go out and test elsewhere, which is that if we want to target employment, if we don't want to focus on violence, if we want to think about improving employment, maybe among youth, we should be sort of targeting the middle of the risk distribution. So not kids who are doing so well that they're going to be able to find work on their own, not kids who are so disconnected that they really need a bigger push, or we need to find different programs to sort of provide that bigger push. But the kids who are in the middle who need just a little bit of a push, a little bit of help in order to get into the formal labor market, those seems to be the kids, at least within our sample, who are benefiting the most on employment. And that I hope you will all go out and sort of test that in your own programs as well. So now let me turn it over to Evelyn to say, to share what she sort of thinks we learned about this whole endeavor.
Thank you, Sara, and thanks, J-PAL, for having us talk about this partnership. So I'm Evelyn Diaz. I'm the president of Heartland Alliance, which is a large human rights organization in Chicago. And as Sara said a little bit earlier, I logged about 7 years in city government working for Mayor Daley, who had been there for 24 years, that's significant in a second, who'd been there for 24 years, and I worked in the mayor's office at that time. And then when he retired and Mayor Rahm Emanuel won election, I got roped into leading the city's human services organization called Family and Support Services, which is everything from early childhood, it's a super agency, early childhood to senior services and everything in between. And I want to just, my role here is really to just kind of give you kind of my view. So while everything that was happening, as Sara told that story, there was kind of my side of the story, right? And so, so I just want to give you just a few slides on my side of the story here. First is that I want to give you a sense about how it was possible that we were doing an RCT on this particular project, and it has a lot to do with timing. The mayor had just won election, and I was recruited to lead this big city department, arguably a stepchild kind of department in city government. And my interview probably lasted about 15 minutes. He asked me, what are my thoughts? What do I want to do with the department? I said, I'd like to do a little bit of evaluation. At the time, honestly, I did not know what that meant. I just know that I wanted to know, what works, what doesn't work. And he's like, do it, if you know Mayor Emanuel. He's like really driven guy, and he's just like, yeah, go do it. And so, and then I said one other thing, and he said, do that too. And so I felt like I had a charge to do evaluation. I think it's significant that Mayor Emanuel was coming in after a mayor who'd been there for 24 years. Mayor Daley was very attached to his summer job program and less interested in doing a randomized control trial on that project, because who after 24 years of investing in a program wants to then learn that maybe it doesn't do what you think it does. So there is a moment in these kind of administrative transitions where elected officials can just say, you know what, test it all, right? Just go forth and do lots of evaluation, find out if that other guy's or other gal's programs really work, and let's move forward from there. It is really a prime time for mayors and governors to embrace evaluation. The other thing that was happening, Sara talked about a little bit, was in 2012, we saw this uptick in violence. At that time, it was the high water mark in homicides in Chicago. And on top of that, there was a very high-profile murder of a beautiful young woman named Hydea Pendleton, who was killed after school in a park, and she had just a couple of months before performed in a marching band as part of President Obama's inauguration. And so this got national news that Chicago's gun violence was out of control, and this beautiful young woman was murdered, and she was connected to this, to the president, and on top of that, this idea that Chicago was the murder capital of the U.S. And despite that, we knew the best way to measure that is per capita, and that we were actually ranked 30-something. That was not the prevailing narrative. The narrative was that Chicago was the murder capital. So there's this burning platform of people trying to figure out what we could possibly do to solve the violence. And then there's me in my new position, knowing that I'm sitting and spending $36 million annually on youth programs, thinking how somehow my department has to be part of the solution here. That said, so the timing was right, but then, equally important, I think, is the offering that was made. So everyone is wringing their hands, and the University of Chicago Crime Lab approached me and at this critical time with an offer. And the offer was, we've got data, we've got a lot of expertise and credibility because we're the University of Chicago, and we're free. So now they've got a seat at the table, right? Now I'm gonna listen now. The other thing is that despite the fact that it seems like practitioners have a lot of questions, I don't think that we're sophisticated in how we ask our questions. So having some early consultation on the kinds of questions that could be answered given our program designs and our capacity and the speed at which we have to lift programs off, having that kind of early consultation was really important to me. For example, I knew I wanted to do something, right? But it was the crime lab that came and said, talk to us about your programs. Let us help you think through where you have an opportunity to do something, and then let's think about what questions we could answer and how those might be significant in advancing our field. And so that early consultation, hugely important, but also just working with us on the design, everything from the different kinds of options that Sara provided in her memo. But we had to think through everything, the application process, getting consent from young, from minors to do the program, the randomization process, all of those kinds of things we really needed some hand-holding on because the department and the city just wasn't set up to do that kind of a thing. Not only that, is we were under incredible time pressure, right? We had to get a summer job program off the ground in July. It is really messy. We were trying to get, at that time, probably, was it 24,000 that year? has 24,000 people to work, kids, at the same time safely on July 1st, and we're trying to design this program really quickly. So having Sara around as a partner to help us through every step of that cannot be underestimated. The other thing is that in order to implement a program like this quickly, there are a lot of staff involved, and there is a lot of resistance in our sector, in governments, and I would say the nonprofit sector to RCTs. There's just there are a lot of myths about RCTs, and they make things harder. They just do. And so when you're trying to get a summer program off the ground, you're trying to think about, how am I going to get this kid from here to there? You don't want somebody saying, oh, you can't do that because it's going to mess up the study. And that's what was happening, is the folks charged with getting the program done on the ground were really upset that they couldn't do the things they needed to do to make their jobs easier and make the whole thing work, in some cases, because we needed to really protect the study. And so managing change, working with the field staff, very diplomatically working to address resistance is something else that the researchers brought to the table. Pace matching, I talked a little bit about, like, every year we have to get these programs off the ground really quickly. They can be sloppy and chaotic, and so we need researchers who are willing to work with sloppy and chaotic, help us design quickly. And then there are always two decision points for a policymaker, the point at which they're submitting their budget, and then the point at which they're going to spend the money. And in those cases, they need to know, well, how much money do I need to do X? And the other one is, what am I going to purchase with my dollars? And so these were key decision points where I would turn to Sara and say, like, how much should I be putting in? Are we going to do this program again? If we're not going to do this program again, I have a lot of money that I could move over this way. And so just having the researchers match my pace was really important. And then, of course, you heard about the results published and how that really attracted new dollars, which really allowed us to expand the program ×4 to reach more children and keep them safe. So where we are today, so Sara said that in 2015 I left the city to lead Heartland Alliance, and I did that because Heartland Alliance is very, very well-respected social justice and human rights organization in Chicago, very large. We operate 5 nonprofit organizations under a single Heartland Alliance umbrella, and we serve the most marginalized people in society. I was really motivated by the social justice mission of it, how big it was, how much impact we could have. And so I felt like it was really time for me to move over. So I did that. And then a year later, shootings and homicides hit an even higher watermark. We had 769 homicides that year. And what we learned, again, from the University of Chicago Crime Lab was that much of that was driven by an adult population. And the city had been putting a lot of money to reduce gun violence into a youth population, not into an adult population. So the Crime Lab, so we went from this burning platform to this raging fire. People really were wringing their hands, wondering why we had been spending so much money for so many years, and then something like this happened. 769 murders. The increment between that year and the previous year was nearly as big as New York's murder rate, or New York's total murders in total, right? So our jump was as big as the number of homicides in all of New York that year. And so just, it was shocking and alarming, and nobody knew what to do. And it was in that moment that the University of Chicago Urban Labs approached Heartland Alliance and said, all right, it's time for us to work together again. Again, they brought resources. They brought data, this time in the form of predictive analytics, said, what if we could hyper-target who we were identifying for interventions, and put jobs and CBT to work with this particular population. Could we reduce shootings and homicides? So they did what they did before. They helped me frame the question. They helped us design the program as a randomized control trial, and then helped us fundraise for it. And the result is now a project we called Ready Chicago. And it's designed to help us identify through predictive analytics, through street level intelligence, the people who are at the very highest risk of being involved in gun violence. We go, we find them, we offer them the program intervention. It's a job, and cognitive behavioral therapy for 2 years, completely privately funded. And we're hoping to learn a lot from the program as we go. So I'm gonna stop there. If we have, I can answer questions about the Ready Chicago project a little after the panel, but otherwise very excited to hear what you're curious about in terms of these projects, and otherwise really excited to see how the initiative turns out. Thanks.
So I'd like to thank both of the teams for their presentations, and throughout the presentations they really touched on not only the research but also the partnership and how that developed. And I think both groups highlighted what I think are probably two really important characteristics of a good researcher. We could call it practitioner, policy, implementation partner, those partnerships. And one is that the researchers listened and asked the practitioners, the policy team, what are the questions that you want to answer? It seemed like a really important piece and a key characteristic. The other thing that I heard both of them talk about, as Sara put it, being in the room. And Ben talked about how much the research team came to the workforce development places and talked to clients, talked to staff. So sort of those two things, understanding what are the questions that this organization wants to answer, and then getting to know and being a part of that so they fully understand what are the conditions in which we're going to try to answer those questions. So I would just ask both Evelyn and Ben, given that those are some of the key pieces, what advice would you give to another organization to help them prepare as they're thinking about embarking on a research partnership? How do you help them think about what are their questions and then get sort of ready to embrace researchers, on their turf?
We should probably just do a PowerPoint presentation about it, because we get this question quite a bit. We fight through resistance quite a bit, even in my organization that has a research and policy division. I think we need to start with what RCTs are and what kinds of projects lend themselves to that kind of experimentation. First and foremost, I think acknowledging that this is going to be hard, but it's really worth us contributing to the evidence base in our field and answering the specific question for ourselves. I frequently tell folks, emphasize that our funders these days in philanthropy, in government, and even investors that we haven't yet tapped care very much about the evidence base for what we're doing, the proof that we're having the impact we think that we're going to have, and that if we really do want to expand programs or expand our impact, we have to do more of this kind of experimentation. We have to be the kind of organization that's willing to be courageous enough to ask these questions and curious enough, I think, to ask these kinds of questions. And that's I don't know that there's much preparation. You're gonna have to just dive in and meet the researchers and get started. But at the end of the day, it is trust building. It's sitting in a room and engaging in questions and back and forth, and researchers are being kind of felt out at that point, right? Do we like you? Are we ready to get in this long-term relationship with you to answer and make ourselves a little bit like our programs open to you and make ourselves a little bit vulnerable. But I think some leadership from the top and some rah-rah about the importance for nonprofits to be doing this kind of work and for them to be heroes, right? That's what I would say.
Yeah, I would just say ensuring buy-in and educating all levels of the organization. So just to follow up from what Evelyn had just said, ensuring that board members, the leadership team, management, frontline staff, they're all aware of what we're trying to impact and what the research is intended to do and the outcomes that we're looking for. So, and that's where I really credit what Alex and Bryan have done with our project in taking the time to really understand our organization, and not only listen to our staff, but the customers. They had a number of focus groups with our customers, which where I think they learned valuable information as well. So I think all those components help to ensuring a good working relationship.
And Evelyn mentioned that one of the things about being in this partnership is having to sort of both teams, practitioners as well as researchers, adjust their expectations and their pace, I think was the phrase that you used. So she talked a little bit about how that worked in the summer jobs program. Bryan and Alex, do you have examples, or can you think of how you've adjusted your pace, so to speak, with approaching the Michigan Work Study?
I'll say, I think for us, the question when we're thinking about pace, it starts with, does this work for Michigan Work? So with a lot of our own research, it's very much self-guided, and we decide when we're going to do stuff. There are constraints that we face, and Ben has a whole organization that he's running, and so we need to be very mindful of kind of how we're doing that. So far, I think we've been fortunate in that what Alex and I have thought is both feasible, but also kind of an attractive pace has worked well for Ben and his organization. I would say in part, I credit that to they have prior research experience as well. And so as part of the Upjohn Institute, Michigan Works has done kind of work with researchers before. And so I think that has made our lives, but Alex and not my life, easier because those expectations were kind of ironed out initially too.
Anything?
I mean, one thing I think, is this thing on? Yeah, okay. And one thing about the adjustment with for pace is that it I think sometimes has to go both ways, and that's something that's been really beneficial to me, to Bryan and I, is that Ben has been able to we've tried to kind of really adjust to him, but also he's been able to adjust several times to us. For example, there were sometimes where Bryan and I are working with the software developer to build this system. There's some times where it's we're kind of on a tight deadline to try to get this done, and we actually need to be able to kind of communicate with Ben very fast, and he's been really good at providing us feedback when we need feedback, but also understanding times when we're given the schedule, we have to do this 2 weeks later than we expected. So I think the pace component isn't just a one-way street. It's really a two-way street of both parties needing to learn how to be flexible and adapt to the fact that they just have different organizations that are working at different speeds and have different constraints. And so I think it's not just something that the researcher needs to do for the practitioner, but also it's really helpful if the practitioner can help kind of bridge that gap too. And that's something that I think Ben's been really great at, and I think has been kind of essential for actually making this actually happen.
Well, I would just add that they're being very generous because at one point I think I missed a deadline and I was slammed with emails, and I wrote him an email back and said, here's my cell phone number, text me if I'm missing a deadline or if you need something immediately. So having that relationship helps.
It seems like both Ben and Evelyn, that you guys were sort of the champions in your departments. And Sara even mentioned that when you, Evelyn, left, things maybe didn't go as smoothly as they would have been.
Please don't leave, Ben.
So I don't know, researchers, if you guys have a thought about, as you approach these kind of partnerships, obviously you probably look for a champion, but do you distinguish between when there's a single champion or that the whole agency is a champion? Is there a way to sort of spread that championness, if we could, across an agency so that you don't have the Evelyn issue?
I don't know. I mean, maybe there is, and I think it's not like she left and then everyone was get lost and slam the door in our face. We tried. It's just they didn't really have that supervision. And so I listened to some of the discussion about private firms where it's yes, we have this culture of experimentation. I'm wow, what is that like? You don't have to sort of give the randomization pitch every time you meet a new person. But I mean, I think the people who know about managing organizations might know better than I do about how to build that. But I mean, from a researcher perspective, I guess part of it is just being willing to talk to people and talk about the gains. And I think, being able to show some of the payoffs is always good, but there is always this risk that we're going to come in and we're going to show you that this program that you love and invested so much of your time and life in doesn't do what you thought it did, and that's a genuine risk. And so I think that it takes meeting the right people.
Yeah, if I can just add one thing, I think like if you have a good advocate like Ben or Evelyn, they can help kind of create the conditions in the organization that can make that path smooth going forward. So I think one big part of the success of our project has been Ben helping both helping us to pitch to this project with other members of the organization, but also helping us develop parts of the project which make it more an obvious winner for kind of frontline staff and for managers. So one big thing that, it does play a big role in our experiment, but that we've kind of, I think, ramped up more than we otherwise would have is kind of redoing the intake process. It's something that a lot of the frontline staff and the managers think is not ideal right now. They want a smoother system that provides them more information. They can actually make their jobs easier so they can focus on, their core value added of really kind of, working directly with people. And so I think the fact that Ben was able to give this feedback that this part of the project, which is maybe not the center of the research, but is a part of it, is actually a big deliverable to our staff. And then giving that feedback and us incorporating that in the experiment was a big part of like making sure that not just buy-in from Ben, but buy-in from the organization as a whole. Because this is, not just something that's gonna be more work for them, but it's actually in some ways gonna make their lives easier. And so I think that was a big part that Ben's feedback and some of the other senior leadership's feedback was key in making sure that we incorporated that. Because I think that helped, some of the frontline staff get more excited than maybe they were at first about kind of adding this additional burden to their already, quite difficult and busy jobs.
I think that's just really important. It's part of, I was talking about the value that researchers brought to that particular project, but you're bringing value in a different way. And that's the key is just researchers have to come with a fully baked pie and some, like hot cocoa or something. Bring something and make it feel like this, because it is going to be work for the organization to adapt. And but if the organization sees that it's in there and workers feel like this is going to help us, I think that's the key.
Do you think, Ben, that having this new intake system and the engagement that the researchers have done with your organization, has it changed sort of the culture of the organization, the way they think about research, the way they think about potentially getting evidence and using data to inform their decisions? Do you see a shift?
So more than anything, it complements our culture. We're in a very unique situation being with Upjohn Institute. So we are the operational arm and we want to be seen as a lab where we can innovate and experiment. So more than anything, it's just complementing what we're already doing. But it has been interesting in some of the shifts that I've seen from the front line.
Yeah.
So they've been really focused. So we have all these cool, innovative projects going on, which has allowed them to focus more on the customers that they're serving. So over the past 2 years, we've done intentional ongoing training on trauma-informed care, resiliency, diversity and inclusion, which helps them better serve the customers as well. And then I'll also say with Sue being in the room, just in terms of the Institute, we've gotten very much more intentional and deliberate about working together on both the research and operational side, meeting on a regular basis, talking about the projects that we have going on. So that's been a great enhancement as well over the past 2 years.
So part of the partnership obviously is getting the study up and running, but then as you come to the conclusion, then it's sharing back that evidence. And I know, Sara, you mentioned you had that little glimmer that this was going to have a reduction in violence, and that's some exciting evidence to share. How do you approach a partner when maybe the evidence isn't as exciting, but it's still important for them to know and to then use to make it inform their decision making? So what does that look like?
I mean, I think some of that is about not doing that publicly, at least at the beginning, right? It's like you don't oh, here, I wrote this paper, I'm about to post it. It turns out you guys are doing a terrible job, right? Like that's a terrible idea. So there's a lot of sort of work inside the room, again, of here's what we're finding, and not just sort of explaining what it means scientifically, but saying, how do you interpret this? To what do you attribute it? Like how having them sort of help the research team understand what the findings mean, have them brainstorm about ways it might improve, And I mean, this might be a little bit controversial, but also just sort of working with them a little bit on the messaging, right? And so like I'm never gonna sort of, I mean, we talked about, you know, keeping the right to publish everything. I'm always gonna publish that stuff, but there are ways to talk about it that are more and less damaging to their institution. And so sort of working with them together. So even if my messaging is different from theirs in the end, helping them develop their message so that they can say like, this is what she found and this is what we're doing to adapt to it, and sort of having that part of the collaboration together too. So it's not like the research word is the final word, but that we're sort of working to understand this together.
Bryan, have you guys put any processes in place already about publishing, data sharing, that kind of stuff?
So I would say we're still in the, we have certainly like the mutual agreement of that. Very soon, Alex and I will file, you know, pre-analysis plans and all of that. And I think that is, I think as Matt mentioned earlier, is not only really important on the research side of things, but is of course a very useful discussion piece to have with the implementing partner. But for the most part, it's been, I think, largely built on trust. The one thing I will say, something that's a little bit different about our intervention, you know, we are not evaluating a previously existing program. And so one of the ways that I think we feel comfortable essentially studying the impacts of this intervention no matter what is because this is a new intervention. So there's not a lot of essentially institutional commitment to that, or, you know, there isn't baggage that comes with kind of a legacy of supporting that, which I think is, you know, this has been used in a lot of other settings, but is the other model for rolling out and having an opportunity to do these evaluations is to basically suggest new programs or to get on board at the time of the rollout of new programs.
And I would say that, so that's what we're doing with Ready, and that has benefits and costs too, right? So I mean, we really are sort of evaluating the plane while building it, which you know, we do because there's limited resources, and we sort of needed to do that, and we're, you know, adapting along the way. And so I mean, I think it's good for organizations to reflect on, is that what we want to sort of do? Do we want to get this information up front, or do we want to clean up all of the messy implementation details and then start evaluating? I think there's arguments on both sides of that, but it's worth reflecting on a little.
Evelyn, can you talk about some of the lessons that you learned in the early work with the summer jobs program that you have now transferred to your position at the Alliance?
So, so there's a lot that's different about our approach to the RCT on this project, and it's largely due to the fact that it's so high risk. So we are sending our workers into the highest violence communities, knocking on doors, in just, it's like, you know, the darkest red spots on that map. And so that's just, it's really high risk. We're asking private funders to fund transitional job programs, so pay wages to people who are at high risk of being shooters and being victimized by gun violence. And that's really, there's just a lot of risk, right? And so we said we were not going to take any shortcuts. We weren't in city government. We had to, you know, we had to get programs out, right, fast, sometimes sloppy, but we had to get them out. We weren't going to do that for this project, and so we slowed down the pace, and that allowed our research partnership to work. You know, I think the other thing is we were able to use the previous studies to say, first of all, jobs and cognitive behavioral therapy seem to work to reduce violence in other contexts and with other populations, but we haven't tried it with this one, right? So we actually, the pitch to the funders was different because we had an evidence base from the prior study. You know, our relationship, the relationship that I had with the researchers was solid and at that point years long, and so so there was a lot that was easier about it, and it introduces, of course, its own kind of challenges. But let me just say something about the fear of failure, because I do think it's another thing that comes in, whether it's how the researchers message that or how or people's just fear of it going in. And I think what we need to do is just change how we talk about the research, right? That we're learning, right? So whatever the result is, whether that's an adverse result or a really positive result, we've learned something, and it should lead to the next set of questions, right? So people who engage in research are interested in the answers to questions, and whatever the result, what's the next set of questions, right? And if we had that kind of mindset shift, I think it would really change people's fear of doing evaluations, fear of those adverse results. The messaging would change. The public messaging would change if you have to release public results. So I just wanted to share that.
You can see why I like working with her.
So I think that's a good place to stop and take some questions.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Guy Halftek. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called NAC, a tech startup that measures soft skills and potential using games. First of all, just a shout out to Evelyn and Ben. So inspiring to hear your talks and the level of responsibility that you approach your public work and social work. Really, truly inspiring, and thank you for doing that. Lots to learn. The point I wanted to bring up is for Alex and for Bryan, and also for Evelyn and Ben. You're talking about baseline and information incompleteness and how information shapes people's perceptions and therefore also consequences. Motivation, job-seeking behavior, investment in and making decisions, quality of decisions, all of that. We at NAC look at all of those factors, and what we've learned, not through RCTs yet, but what we've learned is that actually shaping and changing the baseline is really important, because otherwise people tend to get stuck in kind of a path-dependent information, local information minimum, where they don't know actually about what's their opportunity space, what their skills, what their abilities, what's their potential, are they likely to be successful in seeking a job or in getting financial assistance or in getting hired or in an education pathway. So it's one thing to, and that's what I understand what you've done, of actually looking at what my preferences, what my aspirations, but we tend to think that this is actually not the pivotal question because people have incomplete information about what their worth, their assets, their innate potential, and so forth, and shaping that and kind of hitting on that question and giving them the tools, the power, the information, and therefore giving them also the motivation to pursue pathways that are unrelated to where they came from. We think that this is very important and very kind of correlations to what Esther Duflo did with the cows, right, in India. So that's how we think about it. Give people digital cows, give them information that they would not even consider they could ever get before, that would be surprising and unraveling to them, and then kind of help them go about seeking and pursuing those paths. So I'd love to hear your comments, but also offering that as a comment for kind of Evelyn and Ben, and would love to talk to you after a panel as well.
Yeah, no,
thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, that sounds fascinating. I will say that does bring up one of the experiences that Alex, Ben, and I have had, which is there's a lot of directions that we have thought about going. And so part of the challenge that you face is, at some point we want to get something off of the ground. And so our thinking is to focus on information about jobs, but certainly when we talk to staff at the one-stop centers and we talk about the experiences and the conversations they have with job seekers, it very much tracks with what you're describing here, where it's, they actually described it as like walking job seekers through the steps of grief that are associated with becoming unemployed. And, certainly we don't imagine that the intervention that we've created is going to kind of replicate that experience. But I think just points to the fact that there's a lot that we'd be very, very excited to do. And one of the choices that we have to make along the way is kind of where to focus first, while kind of keeping in mind all of these other really interesting directions that we might pursue. So yeah, definitely, thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Sara Ladin-Cien. I work for Mayor Garcetti in the city of Los Angeles. Great to see some practitioners on the panel. I'm really curious about the work that you've been doing in worksource centers in Michigan, specifically about changing culture at the worksource center. So you spoke a lot about introducing a new tracking system and intake system. Could you talk about some of the challenges on the ground with that, and how have you been battling, like you said, adding just another burden for people that are intaking folks at the centers. Thank you.
So first, I want to ask if you're a plant in the audience, because we're working with Mayor Garcetti's wife right now, actually. Yes. So she's actually a Albion College graduate, which is in our service area, and she's a PhD candidate in studying the impacts of welfare reform in Michigan. So we've met with her a couple of times now in the past 6 months. But just to get to, in terms of your question, we haven't gotten to that point yet. So we're not operational. Did you want to add to that? Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, so that's the May 20th point. That's like when we're going to hit the ground running and like launch that. So, actually, Ben and Bryan and I just had a long meeting yesterday about some of those implementation details. We have like a plan, but like, we don't, I'm sure there's things that Ben doesn't expect and I don't expect that are going to happen. And so, one thing as researchers we're trying to do to help this, which is why we're kind of scheduling it when we did, is like Bryan and I are actually going to be there that whole time period. So like, it's not just like any issues that come up. It's not like just the staff have to deal with it. There are going to be people who don't have other responsibilities who can help sort out the complications during that first part of implementation.
In the back.
Hi, thanks a lot. I'm Chris Larkin from the Behavioral Insights team. I have a question for Sara and Evelyn. I'm specifically interested in kind of how you made decisions around kind of going from, if you like, initial evidence base to doing a pilot from, or at least kind of the first trial you ran, and then going from the first trial you ran to kind of scaling it up and working with a slightly different population, knowing that kind of inevitably some elements are going to change. Over lunch, I think we had a kind of a robust discussion about manualization, especially of like complex programs such as this that are looking to kind of address these really quite complex kind of social problems that have multiple causes. Was it kind of almost solely kind of based on resource constraints or other kind of political elements, or were there kind of like things that you're drawing from like a theory of change around like specifically this element? We think this is the part that is driving the change in the outcome, or something like that. Yeah.
So in 2012, when we ran that project, I instantly felt like this isn't really this is just me thinking, I'm telling on myself right now. I was thinking this isn't really going to stop gun violence because we weren't targeting the kids who were actually involved in gun violence. And so early, we were in the middle of that implementation when I said to Sara, I really think we need to, maybe target this to a different group. So the decision point was, and she talked a little bit about it, me saying, I want to do this thing because I have this idea that it's going to be better for this other population and we're going to actually reduce violence. And Sara's idea was, I don't think that's going to work. And so I had a decision point then. The following year, I needed to put an RFP out for services. And she went along with my idea that we were going to try a higher risk group. So then we did that. And then the next year, I had to decide whether we were going to double down on that population or go back to our original population. And so Sara peered into the magic ball with lots of caveats, because the data was, still early. She was not seeing as big of an effect for the higher risk group. And so she said, you have a choice now. You can fund that higher risk group again, but I think your sweet spot might be that first group. And so I made the decision to go with the first group. So that is just, it's gold for somebody who's about to drop, millions and millions of dollars, to just have somebody helping me figure out, do I go this way or do I go this way? So the answer to your question initially was like, I had a gut, and this happens all over the place, all the time. People are making decisions based on a gut feeling. And really just this partnership helped me move from having my gut feeling to testing some research questions and then making better and better choices based on what we were seeing in the data.
I would echo all of that, and just to answer the question from like a step back before we even got to the place where we had some data, it was a combination of things. So we brainstormed a lot of different research questions. So I had lots of ideas that I thought were great and would have been super interesting, and didn't sort of end up being logistically practical, right? So, well, what if we compared paying kids to go to work and paying kids to go to school? That seems like an important question to know, which one of those has a better long-term effect, but like it wasn't feasible to pay kids to go to summer school when other kids were going to summer school and not getting paid. So that one sort of got tossed out. And we went through a lot of these things of sort of combining what would have been academically or behaviorally informed interventions and sort of what the program was and what it could implement and who the people on the ground were and what we sort of was gonna work logistically. And so, like one of the messages I think that I would sort of send out about being able to do this successfully is just staying flexible all the time, is that, and also maybe for the researchers, like not every idea you have is great. And just sort of acknowledging that and going with it, and you might end up at the end of the day with something that you think could have been better, and you might have ended up something that surprises you, and you sort of have to roll with the punches.
Well, I think not every idea is great. That's a great place to stop. So please join me in thanking the panel.